5:02.
Great. Begin with a call to order. So, the orderly, we're calling to order now. Roll call, I am here, John Rafter present, Mark Davies, not here, Katie DePardieu.
Here.
Okay, now we got it. Dave Risberger.
Here.
All right. Our first item is approving the minutes of the December 12th regular meeting.
I have no objections to what is on there.
Do I? Okay,
I wasn't there, so I can't confirm or deny.
so they're approved.
Thank you for asking.
Now, do we have any public comment?
Just the correspondence that was laid on your desk.
Okay, there is a piece of correspondence. Is there a possibility that if someone is elected councilman, mayor, etc., can the elected individual take their oath of office elsewhere, like a place of worship, particularly if the elected individual sits on vestry or church board? And is it mandatory or not if the individual takes his or her oath of office at City Hall?
Can I ask a question? Well, two questions. Number one, who is this? And number two, why is this being sent to the legislative committee?
He wants to know if it's from Andrew Hamill, who I saw out here, but he is not in the room, and he's just a citizen, and is asking this question.
Well, I think this question could have very easily gone to the clerk's office first, or he could call the county board of elections and they could help him with that.
That's true. Now, can we not handle this and say this is not our?
We could handle it that way too. I think
Isn't that, is
taking
that
his-
true?
I think taking his oath of office at his church is irrelevant of whether he's on vestry or not. And I don't think it's appropriate, considering he's being elected to a local government position, or looking to be elected to a local government position.
Well, this would be for an oath of office, so the election has occurred, and you're being sworn.
Yeah.
Taking an oath effect. I recall someone taking an oath of office or being sworn in somewhere else. I can't quite recall.
Well, Foothills, we all did that when that was organized and put over at Foothills.
Yeah,
I think it's a
we have to
whole-
be like, I'm sorry.
I think it's a whole different story to have it in your personal church.
Yeah, it would have to probably be like an officially sanctioned, organized, and other people presumably would also have to have the opportunity to be able to take their oath of office. Otherwise, I could just be like, I want to do it at my house, and everyone would have to come to
That'd
my
be fun.
house. Right?
In the backyard
Yeah.
barbecue.
So, I don't know, I think, you make a good point about separation of church and state, and,
Yeah,
I would
but
agree.
however, it's separation of church and state. People can take an oath
That's right,
of marriage
or whatever.
on their lawn or in the woods.
Yeah, but they're not elected officials.
Yeah, that's a whole.
I don't know the answer to this.
I don't know if we need to know the answer.
I don't think we do. I don't think it's appropriate for us to be discussing it. I mean, we can discuss it, but I don't think
No,
it's in
I
our
don't think
purview.
there's anything, well, is there an answer to this?
County Board of
Anywhere?
Elections.
County Board of Elections, okay. That is the only thing that's, to my mind, on the agenda, or worth talking about the agenda. The only other thing, the approval of minutes, have we done?
Yes.
Okay. Any public comment? No? No public here? Then the last piece is demolition of garages.
So that's, if you have it handy, it's 300-62F, isn't that what I said? We had kind of talked on planning commission, currently the, I'll read it to you, demolition of buildings and structures, blah, 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 and parts thereof in all zones shall be subject to Article 7 of this chapter, site plan review and approval. This requirement shall not apply to any demolition order made by the Board of Public Service, which shall have the sole authority to determine, direct, oversee, and enforce any demolition order it shall make. So what we're seeing is we are having to do site plan review for like 100 square foot, 200 square foot, single car garages, stoops. I mean, almost anything that's demolished or removed has to go to site plan review. So the planning commission had kind of thought it would make sense if we could maybe discuss ways we could change that ordinance, or maybe reviewing that ordinance if we could make criteria. Because right now, let's say you wanted to demolish your garage, there's 2 ways you could go. You could go to the Board of Public Service and be like, oops, I drove my car into it this weekend and damaged it. Whoops, I took a chainsaw and cut one post out of the corner of it. Or it's legitimately just so neglected that it's about to cave in. And the Board of Public Service would look at it and say, okay, you're approved, demolish your garage. Or you have to go in front of the Planning Commission where you say, I have this garage, I want to demolish it, give me site plan approval to do it. There's nothing in our code that really outlines how they would deny a review of a garage demolition. So one of the problems we're kind of seeing is, even if you go to the Planning Commission, there's really no criteria for a denial. So by default, you're almost forced to approve a demolition. And it doesn't have to just be a garage, it can be, I mean, there's many things you can demolish. Garages are typically, accessory structures are typically the most common. So the questions kind of turn into, do we want to change the ordinance to make specific things require site plan review? Do we want to tweak why we would potentially deny a site plan review for a demolition? How do we want to move forward? So like some areas of the city, ideally with the historic preservation ordinance, you wouldn't be able to do a demolition because of that without approval through the architectural review board. But other parts of the city, we still have that kind of loophole of what do you want to tear down? You basically go to either the Board of Public Service or you go to Planning Commission. So it might be that we want to just change what would be a denial for demolition of a building or a part thereof.
Is this like listed somewhere, like these criteria?
There is no criteria, so that's the problem. So if you go in front of the Planning Commission for site plan approval to demolish something, there's really no criteria as to why they would deny it.
Okay.
So you kind of run into a weird thing where it's really a subjective, like the Planning Commission could argue that, maybe it's not within the characteristics of the other houses to not have a garage or not have a porch, but you kind of get into these really kind of subjective things you could probably get sued over.
Okay.
So maybe, I guess where we're going is, do we want to come up with criteria and kind of a framework as to what we would deny, what we would approve, why we would deny or not, or approve some things? What things do we want to go to the Planning Commission? Do we want to say every sheet metal 80 square foot shed needs to go to the Planning Commission for a site plan review for a demolition? What are we, because right now, we send everything. Either it's got to go to the Board of Public Service or it's got to go to the Planning Commission.
So this goes to the resident goes to the ZBA.
No, the resident comes to me and says,
Oh, okay.
I want to demolish a garage, I want to demolish a porch, I want to remove part of my house, I want to,
Okay.
and then I say, okay, is it really dilapidated? And they go, no. So then I say, okay, you have to go to the Planning Commission.
Okay.
So they file a site plan review that shows probably a poorly drawn sketch of their house and then a square next to it. They say that, I want to demolish that. And the Planning Commission looks at it and goes, oh, okay. And then they approve it. That's typically what that looks like. Because some of these structures are, you know, they're modern car garages. They were built in the 50s, they're built in the 60s, they're just run of the mill. They're old sheds, they're, you know.
Well, are
So,
there,
and I'm circling back to where you're headed, I think.
I don't know how you got that from what
No, no,
you
I-
started to say.
So because I was trying to get to a part. I'm trying to get to something that I think makes sense in my mind.
okay,
So, other universe, they come to me and say, I want to demolish my garage. It's dilapidated. Or maybe I ran into it with my car over the weekend, so it's dilapidated. Then they go to the Board of Public Service and they get an emergency demolition order and they demolish their garage anyway. Sometimes those things overlap. Sometimes we have magically not dilapidated structures magically become dilapidated and then end up getting demoed anyway. So there's kind of like a weird world where these boards are kind of either one board almost becomes kind of a workaround for the other board. And being that there's really no criteria as to why the planning commission would deny a demolition order, it's just kind of a, oh, you want to do this? Okay. There's no real
Yeah,
process
gotcha.
for like why we wouldn't allow them to do it.
I mean, like, you mentioned the, review board, and I was like frantically searching, trying to pull up the part of the code. So if something was like historic, that would go.
And that's where I was kind of coming, where I cut Dave off. There are some structures in the city that in the past were demolished, and that's why this particular ordinance came to be.
Okay.
Because we were like, we don't want people tearing down historic structures that are probably salvageable. So we want to make a code that says you can't do that without review. But what that review has turned into is, I want to demolish it, why can't I? The recent historic preservation ordinance we passed protects those types of structures in specific areas of the city that would be designated as,
which aren't many.
which aren't many.
Right, it's just, yeah.
So the thought becomes, do we want to establish criteria throughout the city? So do we keep this demolition ordinance establishing set criteria as to why something could or should not, or?
No, the question I had wasn't actually that, but I know I've talked a lot about that, so I'm sure that's why you were thinking that. The question I have is there any time where in the non-historic district that a garage would be demoed that would have an impact on somebody else's property? Because that's the first thing that comes to mind. If we're doing a site plan review, is protect other people's property around you, right? So is there a point where you might have a 50-year-old garage, somebody who comes in, they want to demo it, and if it's not something that's going in front of the planning commission for a site plan review anymore, would there be a case where demoing that would have a negative impact on the properties around that property?
I'm sorry, I know you didn't ask the question to me, but the only thing I can think of is if they needed to like extend the driveway or put in like a big area of parking lot or something to accommodate more cars.
Yeah, but that's not the demo. That's not the demo piece. I'm
Oh,
talking
true.
about
Yeah, that's
just
two
the
separate
demo.
things.
Like,
Okay.
is there anything, because I'm trying to, like, I don't wanna have a knee-jerk reaction to this and say, yeah, planning commission doesn't wanna do this, let's just have it go to code and you don't need to have a site plan review for demo anymore. I'm trying to think of, is there a point where not doing a site plan would be detrimental to the neighbor's properties?
Yeah, I think what you run into is like a garage doesn't inherently, I use my garage for storage, but it's not inherently benefiting my neighbor.
No, but would demoing it have a negative impact on, yeah, I guess now I see what you mean. But would demoing have a negative impact on a neighbor's property? Like, I mean, I can't see the impervious surface being an issue, because if anything, you're gonna have,
Reduction.
right,
Yeah, I mean, my knee-jerk reaction to this wasn't, yeah, we need to let people tear down more stuff. As a building hoarder, I tend to lean towards not tearing down stuff. I guess I'm trying to come up with a way to make this ordinance more effective in what its actual goal is, which is to prevent people from tearing down good stuff.
Are you talking about 300-62F that's the point of that?
Yeah, so 362F basically says any demolition of anything, a porch, a back stoop, anything.
Well, I wanted to ask, cause it's not that,
That's what he's talking about.
oh.
It should be 362,
Okay,
300-62F.
so yes, I'm just not in the right thing.
Yeah.
Miscellaneous supplementary regulations.
Demolition of buildings and structures, demo of all building structures and parts thereof, and
Yes.
all demos shall be subject
so I
to
hear-
Article 7 of this chapter.
300.
Yeah.
This is about the site plan review.
So it references,
Oh, that's why I would not have clicked on that. Okay, gotcha. I'm
So it basically puts anybody that wants to demo a perfectly good 150-year-old building and puts them in front of the planning commission.
who then reviews it,
Yeah.
but there's really a lack of criteria as to why you would deny the site plan application,
Well,
other than kind of,
where was I just?
Isn't this something, I mean, depending on, like, I feel like we were supposed to have a report about proposed historic districts like 3 months ago.
well, we passed that. We're waiting now. The only way to move forward with that is to populate that board.
I think you're referring to.
No, I'm talking about,
2000.
that's what I'm talking about.
Oh.
We're supposed to have a report from them back in October, I think.
And they'd extended that until after the new year. So I can ask them where that's at.
I mean, at some level, I feel like this could become a sort of a moot point. If, depending on what we do,
Yeah.
I mean, we can definitely,
Well, so what should be kept in mind is with the ordinance that we recently passed, the historic preservation ordinance, we have to populate that board and
yeah.
make those local districts before that ordinance really has any sort of teeth. I mean, that's based on that board functioning as an architectural review board. Because you have to designate those local districts for that ordinance to
No, I
impact.
realize that, I understand that.
So even if we had additional districts or recommendations, you'd still have to have that board acting to expand the ordinance.
Is there, just to get oriented, is there a statement in the code about demolition of garages now?
That's 300-62F, yes.
And there are, so what I was on a different thing, there are standards for demolition, but it's about unsafe structures.
Yeah, it's public safety.
Yeah.
So the standards for demolition are part of that unsafe structure. So I mean, like, for example, I guess a better example than maybe a garage would be, I have a really nice porch, I just don't wanna maintain it, I wanna tear it off. Okay, well, that goes to the planning commission, because you can't just remove a porch. The planning commission goes, well, what is the standard for or against removal of a porch? Well, I mean, I guess you could make you could make a very subjective argument about the aesthetic, the character of the neighborhood, but with lacking any real standards for that specific denial, you're then going to be kind of put into a place where you have to make a determination as to whether that is arbitrary or based on some sort of actual review process.
Okay, I'm wrapping my head around this, and so I understand, after reading this, this helps me a little bit again, because I know we've talked about this sporadically over the last
Right.
few months. Let's say we had no site plan review, it doesn't go to the planning commission, somebody comes forward, knocks on the code office's door and say, I have a 150-year-old carriage house, I just want to tear this down. How does this change from the issue that we've had in the past. I mean, does this, if we remove that from planning commission, the way things are right now, does that just,
Well, that-
does it not help the situation?
That's what I'm saying. You would, what I'm saying is we maybe don't, instead of saying you have to go to planning commission, do we implement do you implement some sort of set of criteria that say you can't remove that building? So right now, what you're doing is you're making people go to the planning commission, and the planning commission looks at their application and goes, well, why can't, I mean, there's no criteria that says we can deny this.
And if we had the criteria, theoretically, the code office could just use that criteria.
Right, so what I would say is maybe you create a demolition ordinance that says accessory structures up to a certain square footage can be reviewed in-house under these criteria.
Okay,
Accessory structures over a certain square footage go to the planning commission and are reviewed under this criteria. And then maybe primary structures, for example, the house on River Street that was demolished by Salvation Army, has a different set of criteria, and they progressively get more or become more stringent as you move up on the type of structure.
sure.
So that instead of spending a month to tell a person that they can demolish a 150 square foot garage that has little to no architectural value, we review that in-house. Whereas
How
like,
do you know the square footage is going to be tied with the architectural value? Because you could have a building that's got a lot of architectural value, but it has limited square footage, couldn't you?
right, so
Like a tiny building.
what we would do is we would, in our ordinance, we would say, these are the criteria we're reviewing for to approve or deny. Right now, you're
So it
just
wouldn't be
sending,
you're just saying it wouldn't be just square footage, it would have to be other criteria. The only downside to that is it would be all subjective criteria. Like, would that hold up in court? I know Dave Mersey doesn't like us to say the C word in meetings, but,
Well, wouldn't it be less subjective? Cause you could say, you could put like impact on, well, I don't know how you would quantify
So-
impact on surrounding property.
if you're looking at it,
Criteria.
if you're looking at it purely from a historic preservation point, courts have determined that that is a function of the government, and that historic preservation is a legitimate function of the government.
but what about in areas where there's no historic district whatsoever?
Doesn't matter.
But another question
I don't know.
is, what is the quality of the structure itself? This double-edged sword, if I should build a garage which is terrifically attractive, just a beautiful garage,
Yeah,
and then I wanna tear it down a year later, and it's as a whimsy, but how do we make a decision about what is an attractive quality in a garage or another outbuilding?
That's precisely what I'm saying, it's like,
So why
I feel like without that historic declaration of that area, I think it's gonna be very hard for us to, say what's nice and what's a beautiful historic building and what's not. Some people could care less about it. I think this goes back to the same problem we had with that carriage house on Elm Street, a few years back.
Well, so in your ordinance, like we could write, anything listed or eligible for listing on the National Register is a criteria that would require site plan review.
we just don't have very many of those things right now.
We don't have a lot of them. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
bunch that are not designated, but those are homes, not garages.
I mean, so I guess where I'm at now is we're facing, and it's not just garages, I mean, it's porches, you've got a whole list of houses. I mean,
Yeah,
that house on
but
River
the
Street.
things that like I looked at that list a few years ago of what's eligible, and there's a bunch that are eligible, but I think the way they presented it anyway, it's the house. They don't say like it's the porch or the garage or the
Right.
back building
Well,
or
you had
whatever.
mentioned, and I think that's a reasonable explanation, is like, does it support, the character of the neighborhood in some way?
That's what I'm saying, you come up with criteria that,
You could say, like, would the demolition of this accessory building or porch or whatever reduce the value of the home by a certain percentage?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking you develop criteria that could be essentially escalating up to, so I keep going back to the house on River Street. So we have the house was demolished on River Street that was adjacent to the Salvation Army.
Right.
Was a structure that basically for site plan review was, are you gonna make sure that you dispose of the debris? Like, that's your site plan review. What is the plan after it's gone? Are you gonna regrade it? What type of grass? What type of, because that's what you're reviewing for in these site plan reviews.
Right.
So where we're at now is we've kind of got a process that doesn't give us any, there's not a ton of review requirements. It's basically just what do you get when you're done. So what we ended up doing is we have a very wide net, but we're catching like dolphins and tuna, we're getting the whole, like it's not refined, we have this giant trawling net and we're just grabbing everything and hoping, but it's not giving us any sort of result. I mean, that's kind of the, so we had one come to planning commission, the removal of the front porch on Otsego Street.
Right.
So one criteria that we could consider is, do we say removal of porches? Do we say, do we base that on, is it in character of the neighborhood to have front porches? And if so, these are what the porches look like, and this is the approximate age of the porches, of the architectural style. Like, do we set that in the criteria of, if you're removing it, you have to replace it, or if you're removing it, it has to be replaced in kind or with a similar, so we're not just saying, well, you have to get a site plan approval to remove a porch, and that approval is, well, as long as it's got a stoop and as long as it meets the code, you're fine, like what is the,
But are we talking about demo of porches, or are we talking about demo of garages here?
so that ordinance requires site plan approval for essentially everything, because it's parts thereof. And we typically force people to go to either the Board of Public Service or the Planning Commission if they're demoing anything. If you're gonna demo a porch and you're not gonna replace it, if you come to us and say, I just wanna tear this porch off, we go, gotta go to Planning Commission, gotta go to Board of Public Service. If they replace it, we say, okay, that's not a demolition, that's just a replacement. So it's kind of a weird, what we have now is, like I said, you've got a very wide net and you're catching everything. You're getting, you got a tuna in there, you got a salmon, you got a dolphin, manatee, they're all getting caught in the net.
Well, all those are edible, but,
Right. Tires.
tires, but, I'm not sure what we're really considering here at the moment. It's like, can you or can't you?
Well, so the question would
Or under
become,
what
do we
circumstances
spend a lot of time drafting up criteria to change this ordinance?
Yeah,
Or do we just keep going with what we're doing and hope to get somewhere?
Sure, I mean, so basically, what you're looking for from us is to say, like, yeah, we think there should be some criteria that could be addressed.
Yeah, so typically I don't sit around and draft ordinances just for fun.
Okay.
And this was come up by the Planning Commission.
Okay.
yeah,
The Planning Commission recommended that we change or tweak these ordinances so that we're not bringing garage demolition, like we're literally having meetings right now to discuss demolition of small garages, kind of weird, like, can you take a porch off or not? We're having meetings to talk about site plan review for 200 square foot garden sheds. So some of these, like we're publicly noticing meetings at cost to the city for what could be theoretically done as like an administrative review process.
Yeah, I mean, so you're basically looking for like us to say like, sure, we support that.
Right.
Okay, sure, I support that.
Right.
Yeah, I think that having an idea of what the criteria could be is probably more our wheelhouse to say like, oh, criterion or not. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously like well, I guess my question is like, how is this like self-identified what people would say to you? So if you had criteria theoretically, would they be saying like, yeah, there's no historical value?
We visit
and there's-
these before before Board of Public Service, we go to these,
Oh,
take
really?
pictures of them, look
Okay.
at them, inspect them.
that was my
Before
question.
site plan reviews, typically we'll go to the site, look at it, inspect it, to
Okay.
see what they're doing.
Okay.
Um,
So yeah, then absolutely, I think you would be able to make a determination, as long as, to Dave's point with regard to like, you know, is it reasonably objective, you know, then absolutely, I think that's within the purview of the code office, instead of just sending automatically to
Well, there's
a
a,
board meeting.
I'm thinking also, if we're saying the code office can make this determination, and it says, yes, this is our determination, we choose A as possible. The person who does not agree with that, what's their recourse,
That's a good
saying,
question, John.
code is crazy, code is wrong
Well,
in
this-
this determination.
so this chapter is within the zoning codes, they would file a zoning variance, they'd apply for an interpretation from the zoning board of appeals.
Okay.
So there's a recourse if there's a disagreement.
So then it would go to the zoning.
In either direction.
Then it would go to the zoning board of appeals, and they would either submit an interpretation and say, nah, we disagree with that, go ahead and demolish it, or they'd say, yeah, we think the code office is right, and then that individual could still file an Article 78, and they could sue the city and say, we disagree with both the code office and the zoning board of appeals.
Which
So
is,
there's-
Basically, like, if there's due diligence, generally those things are in favor.
Typically, courts find in favor of municipal governments as long as they have a legitimate that's serving a legitimate purpose. So we would argue that like our legitimate purpose is we don't want people to just tear every porch off in the city, and because it's aesthetically not pleasing and it's against the architectural style, character. Like, you just have to establish that what we're doing isn't arbitrary. We're not just doing it because
Yeah.
we want to. We're doing it
And
because
right
it serves a
now, kind of
purpose.
is arbitrary.
Right now, we have, if you denied me a demolition, I would probably sue the city and be like, under what criteria was I denied?
Sure.
What purpose did you have to deny me?
I
And
still
then we-
feel like we can come up with a list of criteria to prevent the denial, and don't get me wrong, I'm 100% on your side, I'm trying to save these, various buildings, but I think even if we come up with a list of criteria, it's gonna be a very subjective list. If we say, historical significance, for example, or is it detrimental to the character of the neighborhood? I mean, we already have that in zoning, with people come forward all the time wanting to change, wanting to rent their property out, and
Sure.
the state question is it detrimental to the character of the neighborhood?
the use of it in that manner.
Right, it's all subjective, and I think it all would,
Until the Irish families I grew up around have 13 kids. But at any rate,
I mean, some of this too is to also just remove some of these from going
yeah,
to boards. I mean, we're sending stuff to boards and commissions that we're paying a significant amount to notice the meetings. We're then holding meetings. We're also holding up or preventing projects that maybe should go through for a month, 2 months.
And sometimes that's like the season that you have to do it.
Right.
And if you're a resident, like, you make the schlep to City Hall, and then you have to come and figure out a time to come to a meeting, you know,
And you have to
to
pay
go
a
to a meeting.
$150 application fee.
Yeah.
And
Maybe get
So-
a babysitter, it's a whole pain in the butt.
so for me, there are some times when we are kind of, it kind of goes back to like the trawling net thing. Like, I think that what we're doing is we're catching the big stuff and we're not sure what to do with it. So we just like dump it in the same grinder as the little stuff and it all ends up in the same can. Good or bad, it's
too
not.
metaphor. You're really
Yeah, I mean, so like, Our current ordinance didn't prevent the demolition of that house on River Street.
Right.
There was no, I mean, it didn't help it, but it didn't stop it. It was just another step you had to go through to do it. So then my question is, why have it? I mean, what's the point?
And if you ever want to deny demolition of something, having codified criteria is a little more objective
So what we,
than having something made up on the spot by the board.
But it's finding that you can have a list doesn't, on its own, doesn't mean that it's objective.
Well, I guess.
You have to look at what's in that list, and I think, and I agree with having a list. The trouble is, for me, making those items not subjective. And, you know, the square footage, that would be objective. But that's alone isn't gonna be enough.
right,
Would you like to see a list, I'm thinking myself, to see a list developed? That we could.
Well, yeah,
go to the
absolutely. I
specifics
mean,
of what the criteria.
another
would be.
very obvious one for me, John, would be, having an age of a building. I mean, a 30-year-old building you wanna demolish is obviously very different than a 100-year-old building. But a 100-year-old, I mean, that's one start, but when 100 years old, doesn't necessarily make it historically significant.
Sure.
Because, I mean, my neighbor would be the first one to say that that their garage that's over 100 years old is not very historically significant.
right,
But carriage houses, on the other hand,
right.
well, then again, I mean, a 120-year-old garage may be historically significant, I don't know.
Yeah, there's,
Having that architectural review board staffed to at least give an opinion
Yeah,
in areas that are not in the historic district would be helpful.
there's a kind of, if we have that list, not necessarily we have that list, but to get the list developed, see, what are the criteria that could be included in such a list? One could be age of a building, perhaps, but as he was saying, age as a single quality does not necessarily make something significant.
I mean, so it is similar to like when we're discussing things to put on like the National Register. One of them is it a unique example of a specific type of architecture? Does it have a
Who's
unique?
qualified on city staff to determine that, though, right now? I agree with you, but I don't think we have anybody on staff that can determine that.
I mean, I think we could,
And that would be
Cross-reference.
very helpful if we did it.
yeah,
And talking to your wife is not the go-around.
right. Yeah, no, I mean,
Well, speaking of the architectural review board is going to fill this up, does it make sense to tie it together even outside of the short district for
Well,
certain demolitions?
The question for me then would be, would it legally hold up for a building that's not in the historic district?
so what I would say is, when those come into question, you require an opinion from the architectural review board. I mean, that's a simple,
So you might have some criteria, if it hits that criteria, so that triggers getting an opinion from your architectural.
right. That's what, I mean, there are ways to do it. I just think right now, the way we're doing it is catch everything, shove it all into the can. We get the same result. We're not preventing anything. We're just adding a layer of, you have to go to site plan review or board of public service, and the end is always the same. We're always approving demolitions.
I think we're all in agreement. I mean, I'm guessing we're all in agreement. The question is, how do we get there?
Right.
That's the issue. I mean, we can sit there and come up with a list of criteria as a group, but,
We can run it by Dave Merzick,
I
who
think
would
at the
tell us
end-
if he feels like he could defend them.
I imagine there are examples from other municipalities
Sure.
that would be illustrative, and we could just think about what this would mean. And, because it's been done before, this is not a unique issue. Also, it's a funny town, and it's hard to determine what is an historic, particularly an area, versus things that have just grown up the hill.
can Can I make a suggestion
Sure.
to you guys? I mean, do we wanna, I mean, this might be the starting point, is coming up with a list of criteria and then teasing it apart from there with a legal opinion. Maybe we could do this through email, coming up with, a list, or a Google Doc, or whatever is easier, with a list of criteria that we can come up with. I mean, it may be 5 things, it may be, 30 things, I don't know. But that may be the first
It's
step.
fine with me, I'll just go to some other city websites and see what their criteria are and pass them on. I mean, we can get this information.
Yeah.
We can brainstorm that sort of stuff or go to bona fide examples. But it doesn't matter, a list is a good idea. And then we can meet again and discuss the specifics around it.
Oh, you want me to look at Saratoga?
Well, Saratoga definitely has, Saratoga's got a historic district though. It's like we almost need a historic area that doesn't have a historic district.
I see what you mean.
Well, we could still,
But you can start with that.
so any sort of, any list that we define would then be something we could discuss.
But we could do this, I mean, this is a working section that maybe we need to do this on our own.
Yeah,
On our own together, I guess, not necessarily here, right now, is my point, because this isn't something we're gonna solve right now.
Yeah, the
No,
point of this
I-
was just to bring to the commission, whatever,
Committee,
if that's it. The report from the planning commission.
if you think, I agree with that. I mean, the use of this committee for that sort of purpose is legitimate, or just form another, to get a list of specific criteria.
Maybe an ad hoc.
And then challenge it. Okay, so what do you wanna do?
Yeah, we're going to work on it, right?
how about if I set up do you feel comfortable using a Google Doc? If I send you a link?
I think I
Okay, if not, if it doesn't work for
would. If I
you,
get uncomfortable.
email us your ideas. I'll set up a Google Doc,
Perfect.
and, we'll get this started.
All right, I think that is,
This has
I
been
think-
fun, I'm glad to be back.
what was that?
I said, this has been fun, I'm glad to be back.
Wow.
I think that's all we have, John.
I think so too, unless I'm wrong.
Wow,
I'm wrong.
I have nothing else to bring forward, so.
me neither.
Good. I'm good, we've asked each other that, and we're good. We're done.
Okay. Dumpsters